The word dragoon originally meant mounted infantry, who were trained in horse riding as well as infantry fighting skills. However, usage altered over time, and during the 18th century, dragoons evolved into conventional cavalry units. In most armies, dragoons came to signify ordinary medium cavalry. Dragoon regiments were established in most European armies during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The name is derived from a type of firearm carried by dragoons of the French army. The title has been retained in modern times by a number of armoured or ceremonial mounted regiments. Origins and name. The establishment of dragoons evolved from the practice of sometimes transporting infantry by horse when speed of movement was needed. In 1552, Prince Alexander of Parma mounted several companies of infantry on pack horses to achieve surprise. Another early instance was ordered by Louis of Nassau in 1572 during operations near Mons in Hainaut, when 500 infantry were transported this way. It is also suggested the first dragoons were raised by the Marshal de Brissac in 1600. According to Old German literature, dragoons were invented by Count Ernst von Mansfeld, one of the greatest German military commanders, in the early 1620s. There are other instances of mounted infantry predating this. However, Mansfeld, who had learned his profession in Hungary and the Netherlands, often used horses to make his foot troops more mobile, creating what was called an arme acuti volante. The name possibly derives from an early weapon, a short wheel-lock called a dragon, because the first dragoons raised in France had their carbines muzzle decorated with a dragon's head. The practice comes from a time when all gunpowder weapons had distinctive names, including the culverin, serpentine, falcon, falconet, etc. It is also sometimes claimed the galloping infantryman with his loose coat and the burning match resembled a dragon. Use as a verb. Dragoon is occasionally used to mean to subjugate or persecute by the imposition of troops, and by extension to compel by any violent measures or threats. The verb dates from 1689, at a time when dragoons were being used by the French monarchy to persecute Protestants, particularly by forcing Protestants to lodge a dragoon in their house to watch over them, at the householder's expense. Early history and role. Early dragoons were not organized in squadrons or troops as were cavalry, but in companies like the infantry. Their officers and non-commissioned officers bore infantry ranks. Dragoon regiments used drummers, not buglers, to communicate orders on the battlefield. The flexibility of mounted infantry made dragoons a useful arm, especially when employed for what would now be termed internal security, against smugglers or civil unrest, and on line of communication security duties. During the English Civil War, dragoons were used for a variety of tasks, providing outposts, holding defiles or bridges in the front or rear of the main army, lining hedges or holding enclosures, and providing dismounted musketeers to support regular cavalry, supplied with inferior horses and more basic equipment. The dragoon regiments were cheaper to recruit and maintain than the expensive regiments of cavalry. When in the 17th century Gustav II Adolf introduced dragoons into the Swedish army, he provided them with a sabre, an axe and a matchlock musket, utilizing them as laborers on horseback. Many of the European armies henceforth imitated this all-purpose set of weaponry. A non-military use of dragoons was the 1681 dragonnades, a policy instituted by Louis XIV to intimidate Huguenot families into either leaving France or reconverting to Catholicism by billeting ill-disciplined dragoons in Protestant households. While other categories of infantry and cavalry were also used, the mobility, flexibility and available numbers of the dragoon regiments made them particularly suitable for repressive work of this nature over a wide area. Dragoons were at a disadvantage when engaged against true cavalry, and constantly sought to improve their horsemanship, armament and social status. By the Napoleonic Wars, the primary role of dragoons in most European armies had progressed from that of mounted infantry to that of heavy cavalry. Earlier dragoon responsibilities for scouting and picket duty had passed to hussars and similar light cavalry corps in the French, Austrian, Prussian, and other armies. In the Imperial Russian Army, due to the availability of the Cossack troops, the dragoons were retained in their original role for much longer. An exception to the rule was the British Army. To reduce military budgets, all horse regiments were gradually demoted to dragoons from 1746 onward, which meant they were paid on a lower scale. When this was completed in 1788, the heavy cavalry regiments had become either dragoon guards or heavy dragoons. The designation of dragoon guards did not mean that these regiments had become household troops, but simply that they had been given a more dignified designation to compensate for the loss of pay and prestige. Starting in 1756, 7 regiments of light dragoons were raised. These light dragoons were trained in reconnaissance, skirmishing and other work requiring endurance in accordance with contemporary standards of light cavalry performance. The success of this new class of cavalry was such that 8 regular dragoon regiments were converted to light dragoons between 1768 and 1783. 19th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, dragoons generally assumed a cavalry role, though remaining a lighter class of mounted troops than the armored cuirassiers. Dragoons rode larger horses than the light cavalry and wielded straight, rather than curved swords. Emperor Napoleon often formed complete divisions out of his 30 dragoon regiments and used them as battle cavalry to break the enemy's main resistance. In 1809, French dragoons scored notable successes against Spanish armies at the Battle of Acana and the Battle of Alba de Tormes. British heavy dragoons made devastating charges against French infantry at the Battle of Salamanca in 1812 and at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. In the Spanish army, in 1635, Pedro de la Puente organized a body of dragoons in Innsbruck, Austria, and in 1641 was created in Spain as a tercio of 1,000 dragoons armed with the arquebus. In 1704, along with the rest of the tercios, the Spanish dragoons were reorganized into regiments by Philip V. During the 18th century, several additional regiments of dragoons were created in the Spanish Americas, some of them to function as a police force. In 1803, the regiments of dragoons began to be called light cavalry, and shortly after 1815 this class of cavalry disappeared from the Spanish army. However, 3 regiments of Spanish dragoons had been re-established by the 1880s, and these continued in existence until the overthrow of the monarchy. In 1931, in New Spain, soon to be Mexico, dragoons were important and elite units of the Royal Army. A number of dragoons became important military and political figures, among them Ignacio Allende and Juan Aldama, members of the Queen's Regiment of Dragoons who defected and then initiated the independence movement in Mexico, beginning in 1810. Another important dragoon was Agustin de Iturbide, who would ultimately achieve Mexican independence in 1821. He was known as the greatest horseman in Mexico and became so renowned in battle during his youth that he acquired the nickname El Dragón de Hierro, or the Iron Dragon. He would go on to become Agustin I, after being elected Emperor of Mexico. The political importance of dragoons during this time in the nascent country cannot be overstated. In several stages between 1816 and 1861, the 21 existing light dragoon regiments in the British Army were disbanded or converted to lancers or hussars. Between 1881 and 1910 all Russian cavalry were designated as dragoons, reflecting an emphasis on dismounted action in the training and a growing acceptance of the impracticality of employing historical cavalry tactics against modern firepower. In Japan, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, dragoons were deployed in the same way as in other armies, but were dressed as hussars. 20th century. In 1914 there were still dragoon regiments in the British, French, German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Peruvian, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish and Spanish armies. Their uniforms varied greatly, lacking the characteristic features of hussar or lancer regiments. There were occasional reminders of the mounted infantry origins of this class of soldier. Thus the dragoon regiments of the Imperial German Army wore the pickelhaube of the same design as those of the infantry, and the British dragoons wore scarlet tunics. In other respects, however, dragoons had adopted the same tactics, roles and equipment as other branches of the cavalry, and the distinction had become simply one of traditional titles. Weaponry had ceased to have a historic connection, with both the French and German dragoon regiments carrying lances during the early stages of World War I. The historic German, Russian and Austro-Hungarian dragoon regiments ceased to exist as distinct branches following the overthrow of the respective imperial regimes of these countries during 1917–18. The Spanish dragoons, which dated back to 1640, were reclassified as numbered cavalry regiments in 1931 as part of the army modernization policies of the new republic. The Australian light horse were similar to 18th-century dragoon regiments in some respects, being mounted infantry which normally fought on foot, their horses' purpose being transportation. They served during the Second Boer War and World War I. The Australian 4th Light Horse Brigade became famous for the Battle of Beersheba in 1917, where they charged on horseback using rifle bayonets. Since neither sabres or lances were part of their equipment, probably the last use of real dragoons in combat was made by the Portuguese army in the war in Angola during the 1960s and early 1970s. In 1966, the Portuguese created an experimental horse platoon to operate against the guerrillas in the high grass region of eastern Angola, in which each soldier was armed with a G3 assault rifle for combat on foot and with an automatic pistol to fire from horseback. The troops on horseback were able to operate in difficult terrain unsuited to motor vehicles and had the advantage of being able to control the area around them, with a clear view over the grass that foot troops did not have. Moreover, these unconventional troops created a psychological impact on an enemy that was not used to facing horse troops, and thus had no training or strategy to deal with them. The experimental horse platoon was so successful that its entire parent battalion was transformed from an armored reconnaissance unit to a 3-squadron horse battalion known as the Dragoons of Angola. One of the typical operations carried out by the Dragoons of Angola, in cooperation with airmobile forces, consisted of the dragoons chasing the guerrillas and pushing them in one direction, with the airmobile troops being launched from helicopter in the enemy rear, trapping the enemy between the two forces. Dragoner rank. Until 1918, Dragoner was the designation given to the lowest ranks in the dragoon regiments of the Austro-Hungarian and Imperial German armies. The Dragoner rank, together with all other private ranks of the different branch of service, did belong to the so-called Gemeiner rank group.